Hello and welcome to this week's What Were They Thinking? The first story comes from Australia and regards a cautionary tale of hoarding rocks. A man was out prospecting in one of the gold-rich regions of Australia. This area is known as Maryborough. Here he found a large rock with his metal detector that he thought was gold. This makes sense, being gold country. As it turns out, what he thought was a large gold nugget was in fact a meteorite. This was discovered after he made a number of attempts to remove a section, starting with a saw, moving on to a grinder, a drill, and even acid. None of these would break the large rock open to reveal its contents. As a result, he took it to a museum, where geologists were able to identify it. They found that it is an interesting and rare meteorite. Interesting and rare in that they very rarely get anything that is truly from outer space. It is easily identified at a macro level by seeing the droplets of metallic minerals that are called chondrules in this regular chondrite. These are not exactly a rare occurrence within space. In fact, they are incredibly common. They're easily identifiable as when they travel through the atmosphere, the outer part of it is molten, and so when it lands on Earth, it achieves a particular and somewhat peculiar crystalline structure. This is rare by comparison to gold. There have only been 17 meteorites recorded in Australia, whereas there have been hundreds to thousands of nuggets of gold that have been identified, meaning that this 17 kilogram meteorite is, by its weight, an incredibly rare and valuable find, both for what it is and how rare it is. In other space news, Elon Musk has marked the beginning of the Space Force with a 2-word tweet referencing Star Trek. Starfleet begins. This week, Donald Trump has signed into effect the National Defense Authorization Act, which will push $738 billion into defense. Part of this will be the development of the Space Force, a military service under the auspices of the Department of the Air Force, and it is the first and newest arm of the US military since 1947. With China's recent history of destroying satellites of their own in space with ground-to-space rockets, this is becoming a more necessary development. There are arguments to be had about militarizing space. However, the question is one of which is the lesser evil, an unknown and uncontrollable event, or the foreseeable but relatively negotiable possibility of two great powers like China and America being able to diplomatically resolve issues regarding space. Musk himself is a supporter of the idea of a space force, and he should be for good reason. Military in any form is liable to push development of technology. Consider the changes that came about from militarization in World War II with aircraft, navy, medicine, and more. Things that even today we are continuing to benefit from to some extent. It's liable that with a space force, there will be a greater investment in technology for space, whether that is travel, logistics, simple technology to make it viable, and more. This same mass investment would be relevant to the next story. Investing more money into Boeing's Starliner will be important, as their most recent attempt to dock with the space station has failed. The Starliner crew capsule was deployed successfully. It got into space and it was traveling towards the ISS. The problem is, it was unable to dock. The good news is, unlike some of SpaceX's failures, the ship is undamaged and is returning to Earth. A minor malfunction in the clock mechanism prevented the engines from firing at the appropriate time. Because of this, they burned more fuel than they were supposed to, and this meant that it was unable to get to the International Space Station. Ground control could not manually interfere, and as a result, the Starliner never reached the ISS. Directly relating to this is news that Boeing's Starliner touched down safely in a desert after this failure. The recovery of the capsule is an important secondary part to its deployment. It's intended to take crew from Earth to the ISS and back again. If either step fails, then there are a lot of problems. A poor deployment initially could lead to astronauts being stuck in space and not on the International Space Station. Failure to return to Earth is an equally grim prospect, which may end suddenly and violently. Fortunately, the current demonstration proves that Boeing's Starliner is more than capable of getting to space and back again. They need only to correct some of their current mishaps. NASA has said that they will not rule out running another test deployment, but that they may also send the next Starliner to space with crew on board. In futuristic and somewhat dystopian news, MIT researchers have developed an ink that can be included with vaccines or used independently to mark those who have been vaccinated. This could be an incredibly powerful tool in those regions where digital copies of vaccination records are not easily maintained or in some cases non-existent. These areas tend to rely heavily on a physical paper record of vaccinations, something which can be lost, destroyed, or damaged. This technology is intended to be used as an ongoing and viable means of recording who has been vaccinated in these regions. This tattoo is made up of tiny quantum dots made from semiconducting crystals which reflect light. Using an infrared light, a special app and filter on a smartphone is capable of reading the signal and figuring out what it is indicating. This is very useful when you look at regions that have limited access to technology but are also pushing for healthcare. Developing nations are especially looking to use this, which is why the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation have funded this research, directly requesting that such a method be developed. The next news item is more medical in nature and delves into PTSD. This is a rather prevalent problem, especially for those who have experienced severe and traumatic events. It has 4 main groups of symptoms. These include flashbacks and physical reactions, heightened anxiety, emotional numbness, and avoiding anything that could be related to that event. In the case of school shootings, this could be educational institutes. For veterans of war, it could be gunfire or even loud noises. For first responders, it could be people crying out or crowds. There are many possible triggers for any of these 4 main symptom groups, and understanding what leads to PTSD is important. This is not made any easier by the causality of PTSD. There appear to be 2 main lines of reasoning leading to the symptoms seen. One appears to be based on fear conditioning, while the other seems to be sourced from depression and depression mechanisms. The researchers believe PTSD stems from these two paths based on a study that followed 80 participants for 30 days after a traumatic event. They found that the depression symptoms were isolated and self-perpetuating within their own system, whereas the other three categories seem to be interlinked. In other neurological news, researchers used a mouse model to track the cause and effect of mad cow disease. It is properly known as bovine spongiform encephalopathy in cows and Creutzfeldt-Jakob disease in humans. We have two cautionary tales for this in humans. One is from cannibal tribes in New Guinea, where it is found to have an effect on cognitive function. There was also the incredibly controversial case in the 80s of this being spread in the United Kingdom. This was caused by farmers feeding cows the unwanted remains of other cows. The researchers injected a variant of the mad cow disease into mice. What is first and most important to show here is that the disease had the ability to jump from one species to another. These findings are incredibly relevant to North America and Europe, where the mad cow disease spread. As a result of this, there were many regulations brought in to limit its spread and gradually try to eradicate it. These measures are incredibly restrictive and expensive. This has led to some advocates saying that they should try and recycle protein of good quality. This means that they would feed animals waste products rather than waste them in a form of virtuous recycling of animal parts. However, this study demonstrates that that could be just as destructive now as it has been in the past. In other animal news, there is a report claiming that donkeys are being killed at an alarming rate to satisfy the demand for a traditional Chinese medicine called yijiao. This is made by taking donkey hides, boiling them down to get the gelatin, and then using this to produce a medicine. Over the 3 years between 2013 to 2016, the demand increased by nearly 60%. That is an increase from 3,200 to 5,600 tons of the medicine produced a year. This currently requires 4.8 million donkey skins each year, and that number will increase. This increase explains why China's own donkey population has decreased by 76% since 1992. This is having an effect on other countries, where the donkey populations in South America and Africa are decreasing at an equally alarming rate, albeit more recently. The product is not staying in China either. It's been found in most developed Western countries, and even in places closer to China like Japan. This is a worrying development, however, it must be taken with a grain of salt, as an NGO called the Donkey Sanctuary is behind the report itself, and this means there may be some inherent bias. On the other hand, it's well established now that China has a habit of using up resources without consideration for the long-term effects, and in some cases, engaging in incredibly unethical practices. The last, but perhaps most interesting item this week comes from America again. President Trump might be helping us, and in an unexpected way. Reportedly, the White House is discussing the possible issuing of an executive order that all federally funded research would have to be publicly available for reading and viewing. This would make dissemination of any information from this research far easier, but the publishers that would have to make it available in this manner are not happy. Academic publishing is not cheap. Some articles can cost as little as $500 if they are through a predator publisher. You might look at paying a few $1,000s to publish in a relatively low-end journal, but one that is legitimate. When you begin looking at the high-end or more prestigious journals, the cost rises to egregious levels. This same figure can rise to $5,000 or more, depending upon where it is being published. These will often be available to the public to access for free, as the journal makes most of its money from the publishing cost. There's likely to be a subscription fee for institutions, but for the public, they will often be able to get access as is. The other side of this equation is where institutes pay to access the journal itself, but the authors pay less upfront. This is where many of those subscription services come in, and the executive order is causing a problem. If it were signed into effect, all federally funded research, which is a significant portion of all research, would need to be available to the public, which means they would need to charge authors more to create a profit for the publishers. They would also need to host the content in a way that it was not paywalled. In a letter signed by many of these same publishers, they write that the move would effectively nationalize the valuable American intellectual property that we produce and force us to give it away to the rest of the world for free. The problem these publishers face is that there is an existing body of rules, regulations, and caveats to funding that require work be available to the public. This directly contradicts their attempt to be a for-profit company. Many publishers say that they exist to disseminate knowledge at a significant markup, and as a result, this decision would directly contradict their desire to generate a profit. In a Vox article from earlier this year, Elsevier is said to generate $3.2 billion in annual revenue with a 19% profit margin. This same debate is why in Europe there are a number of institutions that have simply refused to sign new contracts with ever-increasing annual subscription costs. In fact, at least one institution has completely closed off any kind of negotiation with Elsevier. This means that neither their staff nor their institutions will use them, which directly cuts into the profits of Elsevier. In a capitalist and free market society, the process in which a researcher pays to publish their work, signs over all rights to that work, and in turn gets exposure is ludicrous. The journals make money from not only the author, but often the other fees attached to the articles. The researchers get nothing, and here is the crux of what many are objecting to. This executive order would mean that the publishers are not able to benefit twice from the work researchers do. Researchers will likely have to pay more as a result. As noted in one of our past videos on the peer review process, researchers will write their article, submit it to the journal. The journal will then examine whether or not it is of any interest to them, decide if they'll accept it or not. If accepted, they will then charge the author, disseminate the manuscript among reviewers who are not paid for the work, who then, over a period of months or possibly years, will revise the manuscript. It is then put on the website, generally in digital format, and made available to the subscription service. At no stage, apart from hosting fees, has the journal incurred any costs? This means they get money from the manuscript author or authors and from access to that article with little to no outlay, effort, or cost. Some journals have tried to argue that they provide value for service by providing more than it seems. They argue that they provide gatekeeping, preventing inappropriate or rubbish articles from being published, that they engage in a quality control and oversight measure for peer review, and many other questionable statements. If nothing else, the work of Starliner that has been published twice proves that these claims are, at best, liberal with the truth. Thank you for watching this video. If you found it interesting, please consider liking, sharing, and subscribing. Please post any comments, questions, or suggestions below.